Welcome to Talking Feds, a roundtable that brings together prominent former federal officials and special guests for a dynamic discussion of the most important political and legal topics of the day. I'm Harry Littman. After days of intense behind-the-scenes negotiations and no small amount of personal arm twisting from Trump himself, the House passed his sweeping new legislative package by a razor-thin 215 to 214 vote. The bill, which garnered support exclusively from Republicans, extends the 2017 Trump-era tax cuts while tacking on an additional $150 billion in border security spending. It also includes deep cuts to social programs like Medicaid and is projected to add roughly $3.8 trillion to the national debt. The bill now heads to the Senate, where several Republicans have already voiced deep concerns about key provisions. The administration continued its all-out war against Harvard, attacking the country's oldest university in every way short of a bomb dropped on Harvard Yard, in a move that, if successful, would be devastating to the university. The administration stripped visa authority for Harvard's international students, who constitute roughly a quarter of the student body. Harvard counterpunched swiftly. Within 24 hours, a federal district court in Massachusetts had issued an injunction blocking the administration's action. Harvard looks to be on strong grounds legally, but fighting back against Trump's bottomless malice will exact a significant toll in any event. The Supreme Court issued a highly controversial opinion through its shadow docket, that is, without full briefing and argument, that as much as overruled a key 90-year-old precedent, augmenting Trump's power to fire agency heads at will. Elsewhere in the lower federal courts, the administration's miserable record continued as a series of judges shut down Trump's overreaching and his usurping of Congress's constitutional functions. To survey a very checkered landscape in which the administration continues to usurp Congress's functions while being shot down, for the most part, by the federal courts, we welcome three of the most trenchant observers of the political scene in the country. And they are Alisyn Camerota, an award-winning journalist and author. She was the longtime anchor of CNN's morning show, and throughout her 3 decades in journalism, she's covered stories around the world, earning 2 Emmy Awards in the process. Her latest book is Combat Love, and her really excellent Substack is under her name, Alisyn Camerota, and that's Alisyn with a Y, y'all. Thanks as always for joining, Alisyn Camerota.
Thank you very much, Harry. And my podcast is called Sanity.
There you go. Does it provide it or just sap it from the rest of us?
No, it offers up a dose of sanity. You'll feel more sane after listening.
Okay, sign me up. Bill Kristol, the editor-at-large at The Bulwark and a founder and director of Defending Democracy Together. Bill founded the Weekly Standard in 1995, edited that influential magazine for over 2 decades. He served in senior positions in the Reagan and George H.W. Bush administrations, and he's the host of the really excellent video series and podcast, Conversations with Bill Kristol. Welcome back, Bill Kristol.
Good to be with you, Harry and Mike and Alisyn.
And finally, Michael Podhorzer is the former political director of the AFL-CIO, founder now of the Analyst Institute, the Research Collaborative, and the Defend Democracy Project. His Substack, really essential reading, I got to say as well, is called Weekend Reading. Thanks very much, Mike Podhorzer, for joining.
Thanks. Great to be here.
Let's start with the big, beautiful bill. After a marathon all-night session, House Republicans approved a massive legislative package comprising the major pieces of Trump's domestic agenda on Thursday that included tax cuts, an immigration crackdown, sharp cuts in Medicaid, notwithstanding campaign promises. So, as we know, we're at this moment in Republican politics where Trump utterly calls the shots for congressional action. Is there any ideological coherence to this big, beautiful bill here, or is it just a repository for anything that pleases Trump's authoritarian and reprisal agendas?
Authoritarian agendas, even though they can often be messy and somewhat self-contradictory because they're not quite ideological. It's often more of a cult of personality or just staying in power and accreting power to yourself. I think in this case, the bill pretty well reflects Trump's agendas to the degree he has them, and the Republican Party's agendas, which is cutting taxes, or in this case, maintaining the 2017 tax cut, which benefits the wealthy mostly in corporate America. A. B, an unbelievable amount of money for immigration enforcement. God knows that's their agenda, to crack down on people who are in this country legally and illegally, and high-skilled and low-skilled. And they're doing that, and they're going to have more money to do that. And third, cutting social programs, especially for the poor, and especially when they can pretend that it's somehow just, putting on work requirements and that. And that's the huge cut in Medicaid, with some other cuts in food programs and other health programs that are a little bigger than people realize. So if you had to summarize, I don't know what you guys think. I mean, the Trump agenda, it's not such a bad summary of it, really, right? The tax cuts for the wealthy, the assault on health care, especially subsidized health care for the poor, and the massive ramp up of immigration enforcement.
A feature of big, beautiful bills is little smuggled provisions. As a lawyer, I very much noticed this one that has to be just, Trump's caprice to make it prohibitively expensive for people to challenge unlawful executive orders. But besides Bill's kind of panoramic description, are you focused on any, nasty little poison pills in there that may be hard to individually dislodge?
I'll just jump in about the deficits. I mean, it increases the deficit by trillions of dollars over the course of 10 years. And so I guess I don't understand, this is not a surprise, Trump's agenda, in air quotes, because what was the point of Doge? I thought the whole raison d'etre of Doge, and the stated ostensible one, was that we're drowning in deficits, there's too much government spending, and that's why they had to do these chainsaw-like cuts that were cruel and unstrategic, but we have to get our deficits in order. So it just, once again, highlights the hypocrisy, really.
Yeah. Well, but Mike, old story, right? Dating back to Reagan, you talk big about tax, and at the end of the day, you pay for it with increased deficits, even at the same time as deficit hawks protest.
Yeah. And I guess to go back to how you framed the beginning of the question, I think however many years on we're into this, the trying to find an ideology behind what they're doing is kind of a fool's errand because there isn't one, right? And I think a way to describe it is that what's characteristic of Doge and this is that in this moment of seizing power, it's basically a smash and grab of the assets of the federal government and a restructuring of laws that disadvantage the people that brought them there. And I think it's really telling in terms of like how much of this is just the magnificent Trump, that even when he suggested just for the purposes of optics to put a little bitty tax on the richest people in America, that's when the Republicans in Congress got their backbone, right? Because that's a bridge too far. But I think it's really important because we tend to just make it all about Trump. And that misses how much, even before he went down the escalator, the Republican Party in Congress, the 6 people now on the Supreme Court, were put there by the billionaires who are getting the greatest benefit from what we've been seeing for the last 100+ days. And that's the clearest explanation of all of this.
All right, well, and let's just follow up a little. I mean, all three of you made the point that how are they getting that? Who's paying for it? The middle class or the people who certainly Trump in the campaign made it sound as if he was on their side. But can we flesh it out a little bit more? The average middle class person, if this were actually to pass, and we'll move on in a moment to its prospects in the Senate, how is their ox gored in particular? What about their lives will be harder should this bill pass?
Everyone keeps saying tax cuts. The cuts are cuts against what taxes would have gone back up to, because
Right.
they had to make the tax cuts temporary in 2017 to fit with the budget rules. So he's keeping the current tax code, basically. So
Yeah.
if you're a middle-class taxpayer, there's some complications if you live in a high-tax state with SALT, or there's some complications with a couple of little benefits, but no big change. If you have someone who needs help from Medicaid, which people often do if they have in nursing homes, that would affect you. But if you don't happen to be in that circumstance, it doesn't really change the structure of healthcare in the U.S. the way Obamacare arguably did, or whatever. And then in immigration, obviously, if you care about or know people who you would prefer not be snatched on the street in the middle of the night and sent off somewhere, this makes it easier for that to
I
happen.
feel that way about all residents, basically, but I take your
seriously,
point.
I think one element of Trump's
Yeah.
relative success, I wouldn't overstate it, but he's
Yeah.
won 2 elections and is at 42% or something. He's not, cratering
Yeah.
in the polls, and he has control of the Republican Party. Is an awful lot of middle-class Americans can go about their lives not feeling that they're particularly discomfited by Trump. And now, maybe ultimately will we pay a huge price for what Doge has done and so forth? Yes, but if you are in many parts of the country and in many professions and occupations and don't want to look too closely at some of the stuff that's a little distasteful happening around you, you can go about your business, which has in fact often been a recipe for a certain kind of authoritarian success.
Yeah, I mean, I feel this way in my little bailiwick of the law where, I'm sort of screaming about the threats to the Constitution, but people are still getting in their cars, going to work. It doesn't really come home.
I think that the way you asked the question, the way Bill answered it, the way the gazillion Substacks we've seen have talked about it, and it's been covered, I think reflects part of like a different problem, which is thinking about the implications of this in terms of the direct impact on your life in terms of the things in the bill, without reference to the kind of world this is going to create around all of us.
The social compact, basically,
Right,
yeah?
right. That basically, whether like you can do it in this way that can be measured by CBO or not, you're going to be living in an enervated world, right?
To put out a big professorial word, Hobbesian, where, who get your own, right?
Right. But even like in between the little and that is that as this economy slows down because of it, it's going to have cascading effects on state budgets that provide support for education, all sorts of things that middle-class people have reliably taken for granted for decades as part of their lives.
Especially in red states, right?
Especially. But even the downstream effects of all of the chaos that's being created, all the public goods that you don't even notice in your life that are now being cut to pieces, right? It's like the people who were died because of the weather forecasting, and it isn't a CBO kind of let's sit here and be econometric about it, but we had a consensus for nearly a century about what kind of world we wanted to live in. And to reduce sort of what will the middle class feel to what's going to show up as federal withholding tax in their paycheck is to miss just the totality of the beginning of this tsunami.
Look, I think it's a catastrophe. Don't get me wrong. I think the foreign policy side of it, I think the general change in America, I think Doge, which was not, of course, about cutting the deficit, as Alisyn sort of hinted, just to dot her I and cross her T on this, it was about weakening the parts of the government that they don't like. It was weakening. I mean, this is power, and they want to strengthen the parts of the country that are on their side, so to speak, and the institutions that are on their side, and weaken the others. I agree that 2 years, 5 years, 10 years from now, maybe 12 months from now, 6 months from now, this is very, very bad for the country, for the world. Yeah. Don't get me wrong. I also just think, practically speaking, the people who are sort of on our side, if I can put it that way with Mike, this is going to pay a huge price in 2026. Well, we'll see. I don't know. If you go to the national parks, I've talked to a lot of people in government. I live here in D.C. This is a very big and strong country. I'm not sure if you go to the national parks a year from now, you're going to see that they're closed for that much more than they are this year. I'm not sure you will notice the incredible devastation to biomedical research and to healthcare more broadly in just a year. I mean, so I think this is where it's very dangerous. Honestly, if it were all a tsunami next week, if the Dow were down 10,000 points, if unemployment were at 9% right now, there would be like a huge rebellion. And I don't want that to happen either. So it's complicated what one even wishes for here. You have to try to make the case to people. And Alisyn tries to do this, I think, on her podcast. I mean, that you need to care about the bigger picture. So I agree with Mike that you shouldn't. It's a mistake in a way to ask about the immediate thing. On the other hand, it is as a political matter and a voting matter. And why Republican members aren't as terrified as they should be is because they're not quite as convinced as liberal editorialists that they are necessarily going to pay a massive price for this in 18 months. We'll see.
That's what I am wondering. Like, there were holdouts, as we know, in the House. And I think that one thing we can say about Donald Trump that is, we should give it to him, that is powerful and positive. He is a very persuasive person. And so he lobbied personally them, the holdouts. And then they came around and said, this is something I can sell to my constituents. Is it? I mean, I'm very interested in that, and what he promised them, I guess, behind the scenes, or why they think they can sell it to their constituents because of all the reasons that Mike and Bill just stated. I mean, why the cruelty to poor people? Why are we doing this? Why are we trying to change the fabric of the United? I mean, I understand why some conservatives or right-wingers would want to change the fabric of the U.S., but it is going to redound on all of us. And so I guess I don't understand how they came around and think this is going to be great for their red states, but that's what they've said.
It seems to me his persuasive skills, such they are very much, I don't know if they're persuasion, but they are one-on-one, pick off each person. And I just want to underscore, I think Mike's point is really important here, the notion of who we are as a country, keeping, our eye on that ball rather than do I lose $35?
If I inadvertently was predicting the end of the world in 2 weeks, then I didn't mean to. Because it's not going to happen that fast. The point I was trying to get at was that in Trump 1, a lot of the similar kinds of things didn't have cascading effects because of the things that were still in place to prevent it, like a judicial system that pushed back against it, a time when state governments really had a lot more resources to fill in a lot of the gaps in a lot of places. What Bill's saying is absolutely right for what he was saying. People on our side mostly, like the Trump 1 was not an economic personal disaster for people, right? It's like it didn't land that way for the middle class in the way that you're saying. I'm saying that we should be attentive to the fact that how America's changed since then and how the things that buffered us from the kinds of effects that I was suggesting might happen are really not there anymore, right? And his persuasive power comes down really, I think, to the fact that he's raised like $400 million into his PAC already. And for whatever Musk is saying about being on the sideline, and with Fox and the right-wing media mostly behind what he's talking about. And one of the problems in the way his approval rating gets reported is it's not by, say, Republican and Democratic congressional districts or Republican states and Democratic states. Because when you do look at that, he's still above water in most red states, right? And he's definitely above water with the primary voters of the people his eloquence is persuading, right? So you have to understand all the other parts of this and why a lot of those representatives are not persuaded. They're just persuaded it's better to close your eyes and hope for the best.
With maybe a couple exceptions of particularly vulnerable types. Let's close this out by at least moving to the Senate. You've already heard a fair degree of grumbling. Does it die on the stake of the Senate, or do they somehow reconcile in a way that this or a semblance of it becomes law?
Well, I mean, just back to my original point of Trump being a master persuader, I don't think it does. I don't know what they're going to do to piecemeal this up, but I just think that he doesn't let things that he wants die. He'll go and talk to everybody mano a mano and make them do it.
Yeah, it's hard to see, but obviously whatever he's got to do, it's got to go back to the House. It's still a complicated puzzle for them. But I think I agree that they're going to find something that everyone can agree on and call it a victory, and it won't be good.
Bill, you sort of frame the political stakes in a tweet as whether the Dems can rebrand the sort of big, beautiful bill. Just again, thinking in sort of political strategizing, what is their actual play? Where do they go? How do they go? What do they frame?
Just 2 quick points. I mean, one thing about the previous conversation. These Republicans, we can say they're in trouble. We can say that in a moderate district, they're in trouble. They have had a better experience politically the last 8 years than they did the preceding 8 years. I mean, everyone told them, Trump at the ticket, you guys are dead. Trump wins, they win Congress. 2016. 2018, they lose some seats, but they hold the Senate. 2020, Trump loses January 6th, supposed to be a catastrophe. They actually won House seats. They win the House in 22, and they win everything in 24. Believe me, it's narrow margins. I don't like it. I think there are real vulnerabilities, but I think people on the left have this endless notion that, boy, they're really in trouble. I mean, how can they not see that this is a fiasco for them? And meanwhile, Lawler's sitting there winning on Long Island, and other people, Susan Collins gets reelected in Maine, and they don't love this stuff. If you're from New York or California, you'd like a bigger SALT number. You don't like the Medicaid cuts. But Mike's very right about this. A, you want to have a fight with Trump? That's really a recipe for disaster. And B, you'll keep your fingers crossed, hope the economy's reasonably strong. He doesn't do the tariff insanity too much, and you'll make it through. So I think that's their mindset. They're not suicidal. They think it's more dangerous to fight with Trump, but it probably is, incidentally, than to go and, try to muscle through. I think healthcare is the most vulnerable part of the bill. I mean, the taxes is mostly the status quo. There's the other stuff. For me, the immigration stuff is so appalling and so horrifying, and what it's doing to our country, and some of the DOGE stuff and medical research. But I'm not sure I think immigration, I've always been bullish on making the case on immigration, which most of my liberal friends, my liberal friends are okay with it. Democratic Party operatives are very, think I'm crazy to think you could actually win an immigration debate, but they were so burned, I think, by Biden and the border. I think you could win that, but that's not directly exactly in the bill. So the best thing with the bill for Democrats is they should just call it's a healthcare bill. They should stop calling it a budget bill. It's extremely stupid. I mean, why is it a budget bill? It's not it's a bill to cut healthcare, period. And they should just spend the next 18 months saying, Representative so-and-so here and Senator so-and-so here cast its only important vote this year. The only meaningful vote that's been cast in the House and the Senate, except for the confirmations, has been on this bill. He voted to cut your health care, period.
It does, I think, very likely serve up Medicaid as the issue of the 2026 election.
But they should make it health care, not even Medicaid, because in fact, it does affect other parts of health care too.
And one thing I want to add to what Bill was saying, though, about this whole notion of, but they're worried about marginal districts, and it just ignores the choices they've been making over all these years and their success. And one of the things that is hard to notice, because we just think of the Republican caucus, let's remember that 60% of the people serving in the House right now were elected with Trump or later, and 87% were elected with the Tea Party or later, right? And it's pretty much the same in the Senate. These are people who were backed by the Kochs in the beginning with the Tea Party purging of the party, and decided to run because this is what they wanted to do, right? They're not like people who went to Model UN but were conservative and decided that they want to do this to be good government. They came here to do this. So to sort of think they're following the incentives of winning the next election in their district over achieving what their ideological ambitions are is not right. And the worst that happens to them is they lose and get a great job in the Republican ecosystem and make more money. So not counting on their sense of electoral vulnerability.
All right. Great points all around. And I just want to add the Podhorzer overlay to what Bill was saying about immigration, which I think is winnable, but it's the same kind of thing. You have Trump fighting it on the ground, vicious murderers coming in. But it really, I think the best way to think about it is the kind of country we want to be, what immigration has always been, sort of national identity. Okay, this was my sort of framing of the overall week. Trump continuing to have his way and maybe will continue in the legislative arena and now to the courts, where not completely, there's a really not very good decision in the Supreme Court this week, but largely they continue, does the administration, to get their head handed to them. Speaking of Model UN, there are some people who went to certain elite institutions that seem under siege now. I wanted to talk about the assault on Harvard and the effort by the administration. It's just mind-boggling to just halt Harvard's ability to enroll international students. As Harvard put it, with a mere stroke of a pen, the government has sought to erase a quarter of Harvard's student body. As the lawyer here, I'll just report, within 24 hours, Harvard files a long, good, excellent brief saying, here's why it's against the law. Then another one saying, here's why we deserve immediate relief, so freeze the linebackers on it. And the district court in Massachusetts, Judge Cummings grants it. Boom. So as we speak anyway, we're back to status quo, but not really, right? Because Harvard is under siege and it's got a seismic impact no matter what. Let me start here. Why Harvard exactly? Why is the administration so hell-bent on doing anything it can to bring John Harvard to his knees? And what's the ostensible reason? What's the real reason? There's an overall attack on elite universities, but really, Harvard itself is taking it on the chin. What's going on?
They say in their statement that this applies to every other university and also other institutions. They're going after Harvard because it's the most famous and the most famous liberal school. Maybe they didn't quite anticipate Harvard would fight back, which it has so far pretty effectively. But everyone else is looking and saying, we don't have Harvard's visa. I've now talked to I still have many professor friends and stuff. It's having a huge effect. The idea that because we got a temporary restraining order, which I'm very happy about, is telling the administration, oh my God, we got to be careful. The opposite. They're winning. How many international students will be at Harvard in September of 2025? As many as are there now?
No friggin' way.
The executive branch is very strong. Executive branch that is totally politicized, totally weaponized, totally in the key power agencies, as we social scientists used to say, staffed by loyalists, where they got their loyalists now going down through the ranks. So all those internal checks, which I would add to Mike's list of reasons the Trump first term wasn't quite as disastrous, that they couldn't quite steamroll the civil service. They couldn't quite steamroll the Justice Department. In Trump's first year in office, Sessions recused himself. Rosenstein appointed Mueller to look at Russia. How different a world is that from the world we're in now? How different? You know the Justice Department so well, Harry. How different is what's the internal character of the Justice Department? DHS, totally out of control. Look what's happening there with ICE. So they feel, fine, we're going to have some setbacks. But we are going to intimidate, we're going to bully, and we are going to move this country in the direction we want. And particularly, we're going to weaken the institutions who might be obstacles towards us, and we're going to strengthen our friends.
What direction is that?
Towards right-wing autocracy.
Why are we talking about Harvard when that case that you just mentioned disabled the National Labor Relations Board, which is the exclusive jurisdiction for violation of most labor laws in this country, affecting close to 15 million people in unions, and opens the door for corporations to pretty much do whatever they want. And, well, again, shouldn't be doing that to Harvard, but he's doing it to, that's what we're talking about. Instead of that, or the executive order with regard to federal employees, which was literally the largest union busting action in the history of the United States. And we're not talking about either of those things. I don't mean just the four of us, but that's not topic A, right? It's Harvard. So, that's part of the reason, too, is that it's exactly the alacrity with which Democrats and others rush to the defense of Harvard and ignore stuff like that is much more important than all those social issues. It's a vibe, right, of who they're for, right? And I think it's a real problem. Obviously it's horrible that the ramification of wielding executive power that way. Obviously, everyone's in the blast zone and they're using Harvard as a whipping boy for it. But why are we talking about that when the Supreme Court decision is just really going to do much more of what I was saying before about just taking away, like within the executive branch, the ways in which we have a whole structure, either in labor or in other areas, where you don't go to court, you go to these administrative courts, and now he's just kind of wiped them out.
There's a lot there to talk about. A couple things. I think we talk about Harvard instead of what you're talking about. It's just because, as a broadcast journalist, I can just tell you it's sexier. It's easier to get our heads around Harvard. That's a word. We all can have a connotation with it. We understand it's education and cachet and all that stuff. And that's just, easier than talking about labor law, number one. Number two, why Harvard? Harvard probably rejected Donald Trump. Somebody needs to research this. He doesn't talk about UPenn all the time. We need to figure out if Harvard rejected Donald Trump. I'm guessing yes. And last, Harry, I need your legal mind. I don't understand. How can a president of the United States tell a university that they can't admit international students? I understand that there's something Homeland Security related, but how? I don't understand. How does this even work?
Well, because a student gets a visa, but to accept them to your university, you have to be on this program.
The university has to be.
Yes, and they can exclude the university from the program, in which case your student can nominally take his or her visa to another school. But this is just the way the international programs for students and postdocs and so forth work. But they're taking advantage. This has literally never been done, of course, because it's not supposed to be done. The reason the program is set up by university is, guess what? It's easier to have Harvard process all the paperwork of the 6,000 international students than have individual students filing everything, right? So it's set up in this way because it's just the same way with businesses, right? So it is a total abuse of the system. I'm sympathetic to Mike's point in this respect. I actually know the young lawyer who's litigating one of the two Humphrey's executor cases, the cases that are, the ones that are calling into question whether you can have independent agencies. He's got the better one from his point of view, the Merit Systems Protection Board, which he thinks could maybe make it because it's a little bit like a court. But the degree to which we now have a lawless Supreme Court, honestly, the Fed, they know the markets would balk if he could fire the chairman of the Fed. So the Fed's different. The Merit Systems Protection Board, one of the two, Harry knows all this, that's being litigated, literally has a provision that's based on the Fed provision in terms of the independence of the board. You know what I mean? It was like Xerox did and passed it 25 years later, but somehow he gets to fire them and not the Fed. But more importantly, my friend thinks at least that people haven't thought through the implications of this. It's not clear that this argument on the unitary executive doesn't mean he can't fire anyone. Because if he can fire the heads of these boards, supposed to be protected by congressional legislation, what exactly, and the NLRB gets gutted, what exactly stops him from firing a GS-13 who is a civil servant who makes an administrative decision at the EPA that someone doesn't like? And, this is beyond even Schedule F. You really could have just the total collapse of what were quite a lot of, and I was in government, internal barriers, which sometimes were annoying, incidentally, and bureaucratic and whatever, but did stop political people from just coming in and turning it into a personal fiefdom. I don't know how worried you are about that, Harry.
If he can appoint whoever he wants in the Merit System Protection Board, they're the ones who enforce it. I think he could do that. I do want to jump in with a few legal points. Alisyn, to yours, the very fine complaint drafted right away and filed by Harvard leads with, and a very strong claim of this is just flat out reprisal for our viewpoint or viewpoint discrimination, but includes a APA, Administrative Procedure Act claim that says just what Bill is referring to. We have this thing, it's been here forever. You can't willy-nilly, there are procedures and regulations, they just ignored them completely. So it's part of it, but why can they do it? Because in a sort of administrative way, somebody's got to say you're okay for visas. That turns out to be the federal government. Just one more stab at what you're saying, Mike. I think in part, it's opaque to people how these decisions are translating into the ravaging of especially the federal workforce. But I do think, at the risk of defending Harvard, God forbid, I do think that there's a broader issue of academic freedom, of the incredible incredible sort of achievements of the broad university government partnership. And Chris Eisgruber at Princeton has spoken very eloquently about this over the last many years. So Harvard, besides being the recognizable first name, stands in for some pretty big social issues, again, about the kind of country we are. Let me go back to a Kristol tweet. You said, America, we figured out how to go from a bunch of small colonies to the most powerful country in the world. Immigration has been this powerful engine of success that its positive effects have overcome bad politics and foolish policies. A datum I love. The U.S. has more, by I think a pretty good margin, Nobel Prize winners than any other country. More than half of them were born elsewhere. We're this magnet for the best and brightest to come to this country and do all these things that it's not just about Harvard. It's, healthcare and all kinds of breakthroughs. And that's what really seems under threat to me. The whole way in which academic freedom has been good for people studying at Harvard, but it's been good for the country in being able to develop all these things. So that would be my one sort of counterpoint to your...
Well, no, I was saying, I think it really is bad. I'm not saying that it's any less bad than anyone is saying here. I'm saying that whatever metric you're using to qualify that what he's doing to take unions out, which is just as much a part of the authoritarian playbook around the world as the media, the judges, and all of that, but is just being ghosted right now, right? That's what I'm saying. I'm not absolutely the Harvard stuff has to be highlighted. Point is, and in other countries, they understand that. But when you think about internationally, the countries that have succumbed to authoritarian takeover and the ones that haven't, it's the ones that have been able to take out their labor movements and other things too. When you think about who's recovered, it's Solidarity in Poland. It's the copper miners in South Africa. It's Lula in Brazil, right? And that, absence of consciousness of that component of what's happening to us is all I'm raising.
Let's take 3 minutes on this NLRB decision. The first thing to say is the Kagan dissent lays it all out if you're of that mind. And she writes in a pretty accessible way. But here's the killer. It conjoined two things. People understood that the conservative wing of the Supreme Court had Humphrey's executor, which is simply a decision that says there are times where Congress can successfully set up leadership structures and agencies in order to promote independence and expertise and professionalism that are okay. This is, again, about congressional power that they're simply ignoring. And the court has trimmed back on that, but there remained and remains technically in the law this important exception of Humphrey's executor, which generates a whole kind of analysis. Is it one person or many people? How much executive power are they exercising? What was really, I think, obnoxious and troubling to court watchers, I'll count myself here, is they basically mowed it down, it's on life support and everyone knows the plug's going to be pulled in this emergency docket way. The same way they're doing at the administration's behest without briefing, without oral argument, a really important thing. And Kagan just mops up the floor with them saying, look, this is the law now. We've said before people have to apply the law as long as it is the law. And man, this is the wrong way to do it. You guys are just too, punch drunk on this emergency docket thing. So that combination of basically doing away with Humphrey's executor, but in this quick per curiam 2-page unsigned thing with the dissent for Kagan and the other two progressives is, I think, what has nerdy court types like me pretty uneasy. All right, it is now time for a spirited debate brought to you by our sponsor, Total Wine and More. Each episode, you'll be hearing an expert talk about the pros and cons of a particular issue in the world of wine, spirit, and beverages.
Thank you, Harry. In today's spirited debate, we hop into the beer cooler to ask the question, to IPA or not IPA? The India Pale Ale has become synonymous with the word hoppy. And it's that hoppiness that's created a bittersweet relationship with IPAs that has divided beer lovers across the world into two categories. Those who love this style of the pale ale for its full flavored bite with flavors of lemon and pine needle, plus typically higher alcohol content. And then those who prefer a little less sharpness with each sip. So what gives IPAs that signature bite? Well, there's another abbreviation you should know, IBU, which stands for International Bitterness Units. The higher the IBU, the more bitter the beer. Luckily, at Total Wine & More, we carry an array of IPAs that offer up a huge range of hoppiness. We've all been bitten by a hoppy IPA in our past. Swing by your local Total Wine & More and let our guides find you an IPA that's more YOU. So find what you love and love what you find. Only at Total Wine & More. Cheers!
Thanks to our friends at Total Wine & More for today's A Spirited Debate. Okay, if no more comments about that, we can move to the place where they really are getting their head handed to them and the courts are holding, and that is in this knowing deprivation of due process. So we have this week in a new sort of area, that is the sending of certain deportees to a whole different country than their home. A judge who just went batshit at the dishonesty of the administration. But here's the way I want to ask about this. He said this. He actually was holding about a case where the dozen or so deportees are still on a plane. They haven't made it to South Sudan, which is, a hellhole in its own primitive way, the way Seacock is in its high-tech way. They're on a plane, and he's basically saying, you go on there and you give them hearings and you give them lawyers and you give them translators. But this is what I wanted to ask about, how it's playing in the public sphere, because you have Trump and the ever-learned Carolyn Leavitt, the White House spokesperson, just tearing into this judge and trying to make the claim that these are really dangerous people. They have been convicted of violent crimes, although they've served their time. So it feels to me like, even as in the legal setting, they're getting their head handed to them, and they should. This is a fight they actually want. They want to be using it to say crazy liberal activists are endangering the country and bringing in murderers, etc. I wonder what you think about that, because we've been week in, week out portraying the alien area as one in which the administration is sort of losing, but maybe, losing like a fox.
I mean, I have almost the opposite view. I think it's winnable politically. I always have. I think they are winning politically. Honestly, some people out of politics are just silly. Hurting Trump on his strongest issue does you as much good politically as hurting him on his weakest issue. It's all about whether you're moving voters away from Trump. If you move a Trump advantage from 65-35 to 52-48, that's as good politically. You have to go study exactly what the salience is, but leave that aside. But as moving them, taking an issue where you're up 60-40 and getting to 65-35. So people don't understand how good it is. And Karl Rove did understand this. You want to go after their strongest issue if you can. The border with Biden was a good issue for Trump. I don't believe these deportations, either of the individuals they're snatching off the streets or even of the criminals who they're sending to God knows where without due process, is a good issue. And I'm very much for fighting it. Having said that, I know the courts have done well on this. But, at the end of the day, not a single administration official has been censured, has been no one. They're continuing to do it, as we saw with Sudan. If no one pays a price for that, they'll do it again. The degree to which I think, honestly, decent people who are used to administrations that play within the 40-yard lines, maybe the 35 or 30-yard line occasionally at times, in the war on terror and so forth, don't understand what an administration that's willing to take it down to the 2-yard line in terms of forget about due process, forget about goods. Oh, I'm very wounded. The judge thinks I was insincere. That is not, Pam Bondi is not sitting up at night worrying about it. They're clapping her on the back. And I don't mean that in a stupid way. I mean, she is literally being reinforced, and the White House is, and no one's saying, even in the legal profession, there are a lot of people in the White House counsel's office. They're all fine with this. Shouldn't someone resign? Should one person not resign from the second Trump administration in protest at anything? I mean, I know there are a lot of very decent people leaving, and there are a lot of decent people staying because they want to staunch the damage. So I don't criticize that at all. But I do feel that there's a kind of, I don't know. They don't, I guess it's like what I was saying about the House members earlier. They don't necessarily feel they're losing. What for the part of the reason you said, Harry, that when a liberal judge says, oh, this is really not the way it's supposed to be, you're supposed to tell me the truth in court, maybe they'll pay a price. Maybe it's gotten the judges' backs up a little. That would be good. But I think it's got to be fought aggressively. You cannot let them get away with this politically, I mean.
Bill, I couldn't agree more with what you're saying. I think, and on so many levels, and I was going to invoke Rove if you didn't. It is just lunatic that, like, if you were understood campaigns, when you saw someone's best issue, the correct play was to knock them down on it, right? That's what swift boats were, right? That's what going after Romney for firing people was. You don't say, oh, no, that's their best issue, so I have to kind of agree with them to, quote, take it off the table so that I can talk about what I want to talk about. That's like the path to defeat, right? Especially when substantively you're right. The other thing I'll use the word immigration, but I don't think it's the right one. It's really hurt our understanding of what's going on. Because it is absolutely the case that especially during the Biden years, a majority of Americans did not want more people coming into this country. But the polls that were saying that were also saying that as big a majority and sometimes more wanted people who were living here legally to have a path to citizenship. And when you rhetorically rolled deporting people who are part of our community into this issue called immigration that he sort of like bulletproof on, supposedly, right? It's a moral problem. And it's just like dumb because there are a lot of people in this country who don't want any more people to come into the country and don't want their friends to leave and to be like ripped out without due process. And every time we call that whole bundle of things immigration, we make it harder to do that. And that's a real problem here because we are like the folks who are now polling on them as separate issues. Trump's basically around 50-50 on, quote, the border, but way below his overall approval rating on deportation. And like, just call it what it is. And it's not immigration.
That's a terrific point. One thing to say, Bill, as to that you got to hammer them. The very judge in this case has basically said they're in criminal contempt. Now he's going to wrestle with, another Judge Boasberg is doing this as well, with penalties which will create a whole new brouhaha of emergency. It's hard to know how to frame criminal contempt against an administration. But at least this is a guy who's, starting to do it.
It's very hard for the courts to do this by themselves. There is another branch of government that's supposed to be countervailing the executive and having hearings and making these. Why do most cabinet secretaries quit? Not because of something that happens in a court, because they get hauled up to the hill and it turns out they just can't defend their ethics or their policies, right? Now, I understand they control Congress, but even so, anyway, I'm just agreeing with you. I think the courts are doing relatively quite well.
Yeah, but one at a time, and it takes time. And, there's so many cases. Harvard is one, I think, where the courts could completely deliver a resounding victory to Harvard, but the bottom line real world impact will still be pretty bad on Harvard. Let me just ask this, because they're making a lot of noise, including in this excoriating of the district court, of violating district court orders and, still giving lip service to complying with the Supreme Court. In the world in which that happens, in which they actually say, screw you, district court, are we, a hair's breadth away from the end of the American experiment?
I'm not sure that the American experiment was the district courts, but to me, that's like a small speck in the rearview mirror right now for the damage that's been done. And I think it's really problematic that we keep redefining the goal line on when it's like the crisis or the break glass moment or whatever. We don't have time now, but if you just imagine what you thought the country was in 2008 and look at how things have changed since then, and in ways that I don't think either of you or anyone we would talk to would think we'd be sitting here talking about when is this going to, I mean, it's happened, right? We're not the country we were. And it's more broken now in a way that's going to be even harder to put back together. And I think, on how the administration processes their, quote, losses in court is to remember that, like, even a bigger issue for them than immigration or the economy is grievance. It's the shared grievance with a big part of this country about the other part of the country. And I think we saw in Trump 1 that they care more about the fact that he just keeps dishing it out than whether, like, that district court thing happens. And in the circles they live in, like, it's just backslapping, right? There's no one saying, oh my, we lost this case, right?
Right.
I mean, like, what are we going to do? And you see it in Fox, like when they talk about it or when they come on, and they're allowed to get away with this fictitious world in which we're being invaded.
I mean, it's a very sobering moment, I think, and I don't mean to have been too hysterical in a way in this thing. I think a lot of people are fighting back effectively, and I think Trump has many weaknesses, and the authoritarian movement has many weaknesses, including some self-contradictions and tensions within them, and including the fact that this remains a country that has a very long tradition, as Mike said, and you said too, Harry, of a certain set of norms and institutions, whatever their limitations, that were worth defending, and that I think people have entirely forgotten. So they can be built anew, I think is a better way of saying it, because you just can't go back. And I do think people need to just be hard-headed. A lot of my friends in yours areas are, working on these legal cases 24 hours a day, and I really respect them and admire them for doing it. But I think you got to work on them without succumbing to a kind of wishful thinking that we don't have to worry about what's happening within the government. I mean, again, I come back to this, since I was in the executive branch, the internal checks that existed, again, as recently as Trump's first term, leave aside 2008 or 1975 when the unions movement was so much stronger and stuff, that did stop. They could not have done what they're doing to Harvard in the first term. They literally couldn't have. People would not have signed off on it at DOJ, at the White House counsel's office, DHS itself, the secretary of DHS would not have done it. I mean, they would have said, I'm sorry, this is just way beyond the bounds. We've just gone way over that. And when you have Pete Hegseth and Pam Bondi and Kash Patel and Tulsi Gabbard, and then the Congress totally subservient, that combination is very, very dangerous.
What I wrote about today was basically, we were talking up front, norms, they're so important, et cetera. It seemed kind of abstract, but it's now hitting home with real injustice to real people in real cases and sectors of society. Okay, we are out of time in a really good, if slightly sobering, but it's sobering times, as you say, discussion. Just have one moment for our talking 5 words or fewer, and I wanted to return to Bill's idea of rebranding the, Big Beautiful Bill, which is a little bit, I think, jingoistic and obscure. So 5 words or fewer, a better name for the Big Beautiful Bill. Anybody?
It's the smash and grab murder budget.
That's good. I was just anti-healthcare bill.
I guess that the more accurate term would be one big dazzling deficit.
I'm going with an obscure word, and I recommend, if you want to, you look it up and go with the original World War II meaning. And I'll say one big but ugly blivet. Thank you so much, Alisyn, Bill, and Mike. And thank you very much, listeners, for tuning in to Talking Feds. If you like what you've heard, please tell a friend to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts or wherever they get their podcasts. And please take a moment to rate and review this show. You can also subscribe to us on YouTube, where we are posting full episodes, talking books, and bonus video content. Check us out on Substack now, at Talking Fed Substack, where I am posting 2 or 3 bulletins a week, going live and sharing other exclusive content that breaks down the various threats to constitutional norms and the rule of law. You can follow us on Twitter at Talking Feds Pod. Talking Feds remains a completely independent production, so it's your support and nothing else that funds all of our franchises. We just couldn't do it without you. And as you may know, Talking Feds has now joined forces with The Contrarian. I'm a founding contributor to this new media venture, which is committed to reviving the diversity of opinion that feels increasingly rare in today's news landscape, where legacy media seems to be tacking toward Trump for business reasons rather than editorial ones. Rest assured, we are still the same scrappy independent podcast you've come to know and trust, but now linked up with an ambitious and vital project designed for this pivotal moment in our nation's legal and political discourses. Find out more at contrarian.substack.com. Thanks for tuning in, and don't worry, as long as you need answers, the Feds will keep talking. Talking Feds is produced by Catherine Devine. Our associate producer is Becca Havian. Sound engineering by Matt McCardle. Rosie Dawn Griffin, David Lieberman, Hamza Mahadrenathan, Emma Maynard, and Hallie Necker are our contributing writers, and production assistance by Akshaj Turbailu and Sebastian Navarro. Our music, as ever, is by the amazing Philip Glass. Talking Feds is a production of Delito LLC. I'm Harry Littman. Talk to you later.